Good morning, Rick, and good morning, everyone. So this morning, I'd like to talk a little bit about perceptions of space and time, and how these impact our experience of delusion and wakefulness. But before we do that, why don't we just sit and let our conceptual minds rest for a few minutes? And I won't be ringing the gong. But before we do that, before we sit, I'd like everyone who has access to a cup or a glass that you could place on a table in front of you somewhere where you can easily see it and reach it. And if you can do that, take a moment here, and we'll be referring to it later on in the talk. The one thing that all of us want more than anything else is to be happy. But happiness isn't a state of mind that we can attain. All states of body, mind, appear and disappear. But according to the mystics, happiness or peace or love, and they're really all the same thing, is our nature. And it does not come and go. And it is shining within all experience, including experiences of what we call suffering. Happiness. The Taittiriya Upanishad, which is an ancient Hindu scripture, tells us consciousness is joy, and from joy all beings have come, and by joy they all live, and unto joy they all return. But in the delusion of being a separate self, joy seems to be something we long to find, something that is missing much of the time. It's something that we really feel we need to attain. And it doesn't feel like it would be our nature. It doesn't feel like something that we have. We do seem to attain periods of happiness, but they're ultimately transient. And the reason we can never find that abiding joy is that we are that joy. It is joy that is looking through your eyes right now. Joy is our nature. And as long as self does not realize this, it is bound to suffer. As long as we believe we're a separate self, we are separated from the joy of our inherent selfless nature. And as separate self, we objectify our experience because we are separate. Everything is an object. And since joy is non-objective, it appears invisible to us. But because we can feel it somewhere, we continuously and habitually seek it, which only magnifies the sense of being separate from it. Through grasping and resisting, the sense of separation expresses itself in all of self's activities and gestures, and even in the way we move in our relationships and in every nuance of experience. There's a paradox here, though, and that is that self needs to struggle in order to exist, since without grasping and resisting, there is no self. And as a self, we cling to being a self. So sometimes we find that when everything is going very well, we create problems just to struggle against them. We all had this experience. We may not realize that's what we're doing, but if we examine it closely, that's what we're doing. But despite all this, self remains an imagination. It's an imagination of the moment, never becoming anything at all. Yet, it arises anew just now as an expression of the joy of this infinite consciousness. Now, the problem for little self is that despite all of its striving, this sense of separation does not resolve. And because self and world is imagined, it suffers, since everything that imagines, that arises in imagination, is transient and passing, including itself. The sense of self is constantly dissolving away and being recreated. All the endless acquisitions, attainments, and mind states are transient, and they only serve as distractions from the abiding happiness the sense of self seeks to discover through grasping. So this joy that we seek is not an object, and as such, it is not something we can somehow find. It's not out there. And as I said before, it's what's looking through your eyes right now. It is this simple knowingness of awareness itself, out of which all experience is made. And it is only in the recognition of non-separation that seeking comes to an end, and the sense of self ceases reifying itself. And this is where happiness lies. It lies in the discovery that we are that happiness. But to come to this realization, we need to pay attention. And the main thing that we need to pay attention to is our suffering. We need to really see that our grasping for a better future moment is entirely futile. In the words of Tibetan Buddhist Ngawang Tenzin Norbu, suffering is the master that teaches the faults of samsara. It is the direct cause for the practice of compassion and patience. It is the delineation point of Dharma. It is the condition for purifying obscurations. Suffering, it's our friend. It's our guide. It's our teacher. It's the springboard that motivates practices of paying attention. And with a stable attention that we develop through practice, we can examine suffering and see it for what it truly is. And just by actively paying attention to how we are captivated in the delusion of seeking, we see directly how we create our own suffering. And this mobilizes some deep interest in being aware, to see how we are suffering, how we are creating our suffering through identifying with reflexive habits of grasping and resisting. And through this practice, our attention becomes more precise as we see more and more into the nuances of how we delude ourselves. Grasping is conditioned. It arises by itself, but we identify with it. So, whenever we have an experience of happiness or beauty, our problem is we tend to cling to that experience. And yet, as we discover through practice, clinging actually hides these experiences from us. And once we begin to see this, we are less apt to cling so much. When we experience beauty, it may seem to be arising from that beautiful sunset or that beautiful music. But beauty is not in the object. In the moment of the experience of beauty, there is no object, and there's also no subject. Beauty arises as the nature of infinite consciousness, spontaneously shining through experience, without the filter of self. Self collapses into itself in a moment of beauty. Beauty is experienced in the absence of this imagined subject-object distinction. For beauty to arise, this active process of grasping and clinging must cease, at least for a moment. So beauty is often experienced in a moment of awe when self is kind of caught off guard. Like driving to the coast, coming around the bend in the road, the brilliant sunset appears, and in the awe of that instant, the depth of beauty opens as consciousness becomes nakedly aware of herself in that display. In that moment, mind comes to an end, and we may even say something like, "It blew me away," or "It took my breath away." And that's because it's true. In such a moment, self is literally blown away. Beauty arises to no one. Consciousness tastes herself directly, shining through all experience. But the conditioning of self, which had become momentarily interrupted, arises again. And why? Because it grasps and clings to this ecstatic experience, of course, wanting it for its own, to cling to it and to hold it. But in the moment that self arises, this beauty is now only a state of mind, a passing memory. And it seems to be at some distance in time and space. We can still appreciate the memory, it's still beautiful, but it's not the same experience that brought it about. And this distance that seems to arrive, it seems to be somehow something that we can't quite reach. This is the very thing that sets up that old pattern of seeking to somehow recapture the experience. But, of course, in the seeking of it, it's obscured. And that's why it's often the case that beauty arises in a moment of awe when we're caught off guard. And it's why it's usually just an occasional experience. If we feel into the experience of beauty when it arises, there is something very familiar about it. And that's because it is our own being. And we know our own being. It's what we are. But we have been running these stories and we've gotten lost in them. And so only occasionally does it shine through clearly enough that we recognize it. And when we remain open to an experience such as beauty, we can recognize that it's actually the same thing that we experience when we're truly happy. That experience of beauty and that experience of happiness are really not different. And it's not different from when we fall in love. In a moment of being in love, it's the same beauty. It's the same happiness. The only difference is the context and the story in which it arises. For example, what we call happiness arises whenever we achieve a long-sought goal. And it is what we call love when we fall in love and we lose ourselves in that love. And it's what we call peace when agitation and longing and resistance drop away for whatever apparent reason. In each of these circumstances of attainment, self-grasping and resisting drop away as the tension of self temporarily relaxes. And in that timeless moment, that familiar infinite nature is revealed as happiness or love or peace. And the problem for self, of course, is that we often identify the source of the joy with the object of attainment or the circumstance rather than the simple cessation of grasping and resisting. And because of this, we then tend to revere that object or that circumstance that coincided with it. And we can become addicted to repeating that experience. And this also helps sustain the conditioning then that drives grasping and resisting. So once we see this clearly, we can begin to recognize that whenever we grasp or resist experience, we're creating suffering. We're practicing delusion. We're obstructing our inherent joy. We can see that we are veiling the only real happiness that is available to us, the happiness of our own being. And this insight tends to bolster our motivation for practice, to not just go through our life with this passive inattention, to bring attention into our experience as if our life depended on it, and it does. The only reason self finds itself in this predicament of grasping and resisting is because it reifies time and separation. As soon as we identify with being a subject, self naturally sees separate objects in its experience. And this objectification is so pervasive that even the perception of ourselves is a kind of object. But of course, if our self is an object apart from the seer of it, then whatever self I am that is aware can't be that object. That object cannot be the subject because we are aware of it. And nevertheless, though, even though that is, when we look at it clearly, it's just obvious. But thoughts continue to tell us that this self that is aware is our actual self. And the problem is that we have developed a deep habit of believing our thoughts. So the point is that when we objectify experience, everything becomes a metaphor, a thought. And it's imagined to be separate from the non-dual knowing or awareness out of which it is made. And it is such a clear, obvious, tangible delusion. We tend not to doubt the story of it because it is an extension of all the rest of the stories, all of our stories, everything that we experience. It all is tied up in stories. And so to disallow one story can be a crack in the whole thing, and it can frighten us. And so that's one reason why a lot of times we get onto a spiritual path and we find ourselves hopping back off again because we don't like what we see. We don't want to know. But the suffering of self is pervasive enough that eventually, if we are blessed, we end up back on the path and doing our practices. You know, if we were to stop believing all these thoughts, we'd feel that we might perish. And we would perish. The self would perish. Belief in self would perish. But you, that which is aware here and now, would remain. Remains ever present, despite whatever takes place. And this is what we long to discover on our path in order to step out of the delusion of needing to objectify everything. And this is why it is so important to be aware that thoughts are just thoughts and can never become what they claim to be. So, right now, when you see your computer screen you're looking at, notice how the personal pronoun instantly invokes a sense of separation between a you and the computer screen. But aside from transient thought, which tells us otherwise, notice there's no actual distinction between the computer screen and the knowing out of which it is made. It arises as knowing, right? It's your experience right now. The computer screen is the knowing itself. It is made of knowing. And there is no it. There's only knowing. I hope that makes sense. Actually, if it makes sense, it's probably problematic. Anyway, so we'll let that ride for a moment. We'll come back to some of this. But an important reason for why the grasping of self-reification is so seductive is that we fully believe the story that we exist in time. That when we get what we want, we will feel better in a future moment. And we know this because memories, which are thoughts, tell us of past actions in which this was the case. And although time is a deception, it is a profoundly useful one, since it allows all this vast creativity to proceed. And it becomes a delusion for us when we forget it is just a convenience and we take it to be real. The reality is there is no time. But because our world is built on a consensual belief in time, we tend to take it to be real in itself. And this has far-reaching and confusing effects on our experience of the world and in the way that we delude ourselves about who we are. So as soon as time becomes real to us, our entire experience seems to freeze into objects separated in time. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, for him, the delusion of time is a very big deal. He says, time is what keeps the light from reaching us. There is no greater obstacle to God than time. And not only time, but temporalities. And not only temporal things, but temporal affectations. And not only temporal affectations, but the very taint and smell of time. So what he's speaking about is not this quote, he's talking about the delusion in which we take time to be real. He's not saying that there's anything wrong with time or that even that time is a delusion and a problem. It's when we don't recognize it for what it is that all of those things that he was saying come to be true. So if we examine time, we discover how easily we're deceived by it. Time is considered to be the duration between two events. But when we talk of two events, that's not our experience. We do not experience two events except as a thought or a series of thoughts. That sounds strange maybe, but in the arising of an event, say this one, let me snap my fingers here. And then when we snap our fingers again, mind tells us that time passed between these two sounds. But notice, both sounds arise just now as memory. And this, just now. So as memory or thoughts, we have this idea of two events, but it's just an idea. We never experience two events because awareness is only aware now. We can't actually verify a previous snap without relying on that memory, which is always just a thought arising now. And if we don't cling to the contents of thoughts as being real in themselves, we can see that whatever arises only now, and it is instantly gone. Thoughts and really all experience are profoundly impermanent. And although we may believe we have the same thought or experience over and over, every one of them is new, arising just now. If we look at the historical sense of self, our childhood, our memories of yesterday, or even a few moments ago, we can see these are thoughts arising just now. And although imaginary, such memories are not only useful but richly creative. But the reality is that we have no actual past, no beginning, no birth, and no ending or death. Yet we do have some very rich stories. And stories themselves, they're not the problem. They are our creative expression. Suffering only arises when we take these stories to be real in themselves. The more we become aware of our timeless or eternal nature in direct experience, the less we reify stories, the more obvious stories are just stories, and the more we can enjoy them for what they truly are. So we can easily recognize timelessness. We experience it always. It's what we are. We're timeless. It's our experience, actually. And that's because consciousness is only aware just now. It is consciousness that is aware. Timelessness is not hidden from us. We are just distracted from noticing it by the frame of reference of separateness, which includes reified memories, other thoughts and stories, and conditioned habits of perception, and the lure to find happiness. But one thing that throws us, that doesn't seem so simple, is objective forms, which we take to exist in time out there in the world. How can a stone not exist in time? Or a mountain? But in actuality, through observation, through attention, we can discover all form is coming into being just now. When we actually examine our imaginative past, we can see it is never other than thoughts arising now, and our social relationships, our cultural milieu, our language, and visual forms are all based upon this concept. The concept of passing time. And so all of these things are reified just now as a palpable sense of being an actual entity that is moving through time. Passing time is an interpreted experience, and because it is reified in thoughts and attachments arising just now, it has the power to cinch up our deluded beliefs as an inscrutable fact. And so thought tells us repeatedly that the world and ourselves must exist in time as separate entities, since that is the lens through which everyone seems to see. And, we've heard of Occam's razor. Occam's razor tells us that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And based upon our beliefs, time and duality seem to be by far the simplest explanation. I mean, things exist in time. I'm here, you're there. What could be more simple than that? But if we pay close attention once again, and we begin to experience the reality of timelessness, stepping out of our stories, we begin to discover the true simplicity, which needs no explanation at all. Now, this doesn't mean that our conventional world is somehow negated, or that we, become somehow catatonic. It's just a transformation in the way we see things. But even imaginary time in itself, as I said, is not a delusion as long as it's recognized as imagination within experience. And when identified with an imaginary self, even if we understand all this, that time is imaginary and all, that it's conditioned and all that, we still have very convincing thoughts and emotional attachments, in most cases, to our old beliefs, which continue to assert themselves. Grasping for future happiness, seeking to feel better in a future moment, still plays out. This is why it is so important to not just understand that time is imaginary, but to put it into practice, to begin looking at experience closely, more and more. And the best time to do this is when suffering and longing arise. When we are suffering, right there's a movement created in mind to move out of this moment. Find something better. So in identification with self, we objectify images, thoughts, and feelings as my thoughts, my emotions, and my experience. And as such, we can now be at odds with how we feel. Because an emotion cannot actually be separated from our being, if we take it to be objective, we create an imaginary boundary between ourself and that emotion. And if we resist that difficult emotion, we further enhance the experience of the one who does so, who resists. And thereby we are reifying once again the separation from our being. And this is why we suffer. So let's do a little guided meditation to take a look into this a bit. And it would be more useful, I think, rather than me talking about it, to actually bring your attention into your own direct experience. So for this meditation, we'll need that little cup at some point. So, okay. So everybody get comfy. Okay. So to begin, bring attention to the sensations of the body breathing wherever it is felt most prominently. Noticing these sensations arise and pass just now as the knowing of them, the knowing out of which they are made in awareness. There's no distance between the sensation and the knowing of it. Feel the sensations of your hands. When we say hands, notice this is a perception arising in consciousness. If we see our hands, that is a perception arising in consciousness. We don't experience anything outside of the knowing. Sensations of your hands, likewise, arise just now as the knowing of them. If it seems to you that you are someone who is aware, notice this is a perception arising just now as the knowing, as awareness itself. It is made in this moment through consciousness's power of imagination. So resting as this naked knowingness itself, see if you can observe and feel all the phenomena arising within your being, flowing through your being just now, arising all by themselves, arising and passing. Just now. Recall getting out of bed this morning and notice, although we consider that a past memory, is actually a thought arising just now. Notice all memories are no closer nor farther away than other thoughts that are arising just now. Now bring up the perception of my body, your body, and notice, aside from what thoughts tell us, this body only appears as an objective body when attention is passive. When attention is not mobilized and paying attention, but it's just kind of relaxed, not particularly interested, all kinds of magic tricks get performed and we don't recognize that they're just tricks. So bring attention to the sensations of your hands, what we call hands, these solid things, and see if you can notice that they arise only now. And you can notice that the perception and sensations of hands vanish as attention is called to be aware of, say, the arms. So become aware of arms. Feel the sensations of arms. And feel the sensations of the face. And notice all of these dissolve away when attention moves from them. Thoughts may tell us that they are still here, but these are thoughts. And thoughts do not know. They are trained to support the story. So what we're doing here is we're cutting through that story and examining directly in experience. And we see that what appear to be solid forms are really transient phenomena arising as the knowing. Now bring your attention to the perception of your cup on the table in front of you. And notice how it arises just now. And all the other phenomena, perceptions that we were examining, they're gone. Unless, of course, we think of them. We can think about anything and instantly we can be having an experience of it. But notice that this cup, flask, glass, whatever it is, arises as a mental image in awareness just now. It appears to be outside of the body-mind, outside of you. But you, the perception of you, the perception of the cup, it is all arising as the knowing of them within awareness, equally within awareness just now. Now, reach out and pick up the cup. Close your eyes once you pick it up. And notice the perception in mind of me holding the cup. It's fleeting, but it's there. It's a memory. It's what we call memory. It's a fleeting thought. And when we examine it through this lens of awareness, we can see there is no separation between someone holding the cup and the cup itself. These are momentary arisings within consciousness. So feel the sensations of what we call a cup. Contours of the cup. Sense of temperature and weight. And notice that without the stories, without the perceptions, we can see that the sensations arise by themselves. So let's place our cup back on the table. Open our eyes and notice the visual cup also is a perception arising in awareness. Again, made of the knowing of it. This is all conditioned. If we were a newborn baby, we would not see a cup. Cup is conditioned. It's a learned construct born of precise correlations between sense fields. And these have been laid down meticulously through much practice. And it almost sounds like when we talk about conditioning that we learned about the cup through time. But this isn't really the case. It's actually arising just now. Everything is arising just now. The conditioning is a timeless, logical conditioning. And the discrepancy arises partly due to language.
Smartphone disconnected. 2 devices connected.
Can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so look around the room And verify this for yourself. Look around. All phenomena arise and pass just now in awareness as the knowing of them. We look over to the left, all the phenomena over here on the right, they vanish. It's just showing us they are coming into being when attention lands on them. When attention brings them into focus, there they are. But they only exist in awareness. And the deception here is that we project outward because we have all of these precise and predictable correlations in every tiny microscopic movement of the body-mind world. And it is all tied together. And it's unfathomable to the mind because the mind is just a conditioning that arises within this vastness, consciousness itself. So not only the body-mind, but the room, and everything in the room, it all arises just now. You take a few minutes here and just settle in as the knowing itself. If thoughts arise, the mind says, I'm having those thoughts. They're arising. They're conditioned to arise. Rest as the knowing. Timeless. So the more we are able to settle into naked awareness, the more we are able to feel directly that everything arises as the knowing itself. And this can be profoundly illuminating. We begin to realize we can't actually find anything that is not arising as awareness. All is awareness itself. This isn't much good if we don't recognize it. And so this is the purpose behind the practice. And what we discover then is that awareness never actually experiences anything but itself in its creative display. Just now, we all arise together within you as the knowing. And if we just open into any resistance that we may experience, we see it arises also as this openness of awareness. And here we discover this profound intimacy, not just with ourselves here, but in all experience. And not just with beings, but with difficult emotions. And difficult emotions are really the driver for a lot of the delusion that we experience. Disappointments, grief, anger, frustration about the pandemic, the political system, goes on and on. All of it arises as your being. And if they are difficult emotions, it is only because they are not recognized for what they truly are. If they're difficult and we're trying to resist them or push them away, we are creating delusion. When we are with them, they are ever new, and we see the stories that are conditioned by them for what they truly are. When our false image of who we believe ourselves to be is threatened, this becomes a moment when the truth of our being, our enlightened nature, is calling us. It's so easy just to turn away, to deny. We've been insulted. We can respond with anger and blame. But it's just more grasping, more resisting, more delusion. In the words of Zen teacher Joko Beck, she says, rather than experience disappointment, we resort to anger or greed or gossip, criticism. Yet it's the moment of being that disappointment itself which is fruitful. And if we are not willing to do that, at least we should notice that we are not willing to do that. The moment of disappointment in life is an incomparable gift that we receive many times a day if we're alert. And that's really the point. To be that emotion. We are that emotion. We realize it is our own being, and we are less apt to try to get rid of it when we realize that. More and more we recognize that every time we run from feelings, anything that we don't like, we are reconditioning and reifying the sense of self. And at the heart of all of our suffering is this longing to feel better in a future moment. And we see this clearly. We can investigate this longing, this experience of longing. how it comes into being, and how it mobilizes our grasping. But to examine longing, a useful way to begin is by examining suffering whenever it seems to arise. Whenever we suffer, there is a movement of longing to get away from that suffering, whatever it is. It's really important to recognize longing through a heartful awareness, to recognize longing is a kind of entity, a kind of creature, being, that just wants to be happy. And associated with it is a desire to grasp at whatever it believes will bring it happiness. And all of this, of course, as I've said, it's all conditioned, and it just unfolds. And if we aren't mindful, it will carry us, and we will then struggle to resolve it through grasping or resisting. When longing arises, our impulse to quell it is very strong in many cases, and we experience that as suffering. And it is driven by the sense of being separate. We've created a boundary between ourselves and that feeling. So a very useful practice for working with longing is to allow it to be your meditation object when it arises. When longing arises, see if you can just be aware of it. Even for a few moments. You know, if you have a headache, feel the headache before you take something for it. Let it be there. Feel the longing for something more. And then take something, if that's what you do. Notice the power behind this feeling as it calls to do something. If we just stay with the longing without trying to satisfy it, without grasping for something more, without expectation. In other words, not trying to alleviate it. We are in that moment, in that practice, manifesting our selfless, compassionate, loving nature to simply be with that feeling as it is. Just to be with that suffering emotion that longs for something more, feeling it as it is without trying to get rid of it, not trying to satisfy it. We are relinquishing our self-concern, and we are expressing our intrinsic nature. And through that process, we may discover joy. This can be powerful practice, and of course, we may not experience joy at all. And if expected joy, and we feel a sense of being slighted because I did that meditation, I was sitting with it, and I don't feel any joy. Right there, that is the longing showing itself once again in a different form, the same thing, seeking something more. So we just feel that longing just as it is. And this kind of practice trains attention to rest with feeling tones and to become familiar with all the ways grasping may continue, even in the subtle microcosm of experience. As we continue to look in direct experience, we can see there's no knower of any of this. It's all habitual unfolding. We grasp at thoughts telling us we are the one who knows. But rather than buy the story again and again, we can just be aware of that transient thought. What is it which hears? It sees and feels. If it isn't an objective imagination. When we look directly, we see there is no objective or subjective entity apart from the hearing and the seeing. And if you practice noticing this with all your senses, you begin to break through the habit of belief. You begin to recognize and directly cognize that there is no distinction between seeing and what's seen, between feeling and what's felt, between tasting and what's tasted, and between knowing and what's known. As one Zen master described his enlightenment, he said, "When I heard the temple bell ring, suddenly there was no bell and no I, just the ringing." And that's it. So in that moment, if a thought of self were to arise, it would be no different than the sound of the bell. When thoughts of self arise, they arise to themselves as infinite consciousness, just now. If we believe I'm having those thoughts, that is just another creative thought arising within consciousness. And this is why we hear Zen Master Wang Po tell us, our nature is fundamentally without spatial dimensions, without passions or activities, delusions or right understanding. You must clearly understand that in it there are no things, no men, and no Buddhas. For this void contains not the smallest hair's breadth of anything that can be viewed spatially. It depends on nothing and is attached to nothing. It is all-pervading, spotless beauty. It is the self-existent and uncreated absolute. It is knowingness itself. And again, it is this very knowing which is seeing through your eyes right now, feeling your sensations, and aware of your thoughts. And finally, in the words of Hindu sage Shankara, there is sorrow in finitude. The self is beyond time, beyond space and objects. It is infinite and hence of the nature of absolute happiness. And that's what we are. So that's the talk that I had for you this morning. And till we meet again, peace to you all.